It begins in the stillness, the kind of stillness that hums softly beneath thought, where the air feels charged yet invisible. You have known moments like this, when something inside you pauses, as though the unseen world holds its breath. And as you rest there, you realize it is not the outer world waiting on you, but you who have been waiting to remember. That night, I sat quietly in my room, the lamp casting a warm circle of light, my hands resting loosely on my lap. The noise of the day had long since faded. I felt no effort, no strain, only the faint rhythm of my own breathing. And into that gentle space came 7 simple words, words I did not invent, but remembered as though they had been sleeping in the folds of my mind. 7 words that would become the key to what unfolded before the sun returned. Most would tell you that the path to such a result, $1,000 appearing without a trace of logic, would require hustle, contacts, or a carefully laid plan. But the truth is older than the world itself. It is consciousness that moves the mountains, not the hands that climb them. Those 7 words were not a request, not a plea to some distant deity. They were a seed, whole, complete, containing the full pattern of the harvest within them. I let them take root, not in the restless soil of doubt, but in the deep garden of the inner man. I did not repeat them as though trying to force them into being. I simply rested in the fragrance of their truth. In that stillness, I could feel what the words implied, the scene they painted, the invisible state they called me into. It was as if I had already crossed the threshold into a room where the matter was finished, the gift already in my possession. I was not seeking, I was remembering. The end was as real as the chair beneath me, and in that awareness, I felt something shift, not in the air, but in me. You see, the secret is not the words themselves, but the state they awaken. Without the state, they are lifeless. With the state, they are creative fire. As I drifted towards sleep, I allowed myself to live in the world those words described. I could sense the texture of the joy, the ease in my chest, the calm assurance that nothing needed to be done. It was finished. My hands, though empty in the outer world, had already touched the crisp edges of the bills. My eyes, though closed, had already counted them. Many would dismiss this as pleasant fantasy. But what is fantasy, if not the clay from which all form is shaped? Every bridge you have crossed, every house you have entered, every life you have known, began as unseen thought, made solid only because someone dared to abide in it long enough for the world to conform. That night, I made no bargain. I asked no how. I simply inhabited the reality in which the $1,000 was mine, letting the words cradle me into sleep. And as the darkness wrapped around me, I remembered the verse, "When ye pray, believe that ye receive them, and ye shall have them." Not will receive, but receive, now in the moment of asking. I understood at last that the moment I claimed it inwardly, it was mine. The world might take the hours of the night to catch up, but consciousness had already moved. I awoke with a calm that felt almost strange, as though I were carrying a secret the morning could not touch. There was no rush to check my accounts, no itch of impatience. The stillness remained, unbroken. And yet, even as I poured my tea, the outer world began to arrange itself in quiet obedience to what had been settled within. A message appeared, then another. Money, unexpected, clean, without obligation, exactly $1,000. No more, no less. You might think the marvel was in the speed, but it was not. The marvel was in the knowing. For once you have felt the certainty of the end before it appears, you realize there is no difference between the seed and the fruit, only the time it takes for your senses to witness what your spirit has already claimed. And as I stood there, holding the evidence in my hand, the question rose unbidden, like a whisper from eternity. If 7 words could do this, what other sleeping seeds lie waiting for you to remember them? But even that question was only the faint beginning of what I was about to discover, for there is a deeper mystery beneath the words themselves, one that most will never touch, though it stands closer than breathing. And it was into that mystery that I was about to step. And as that question lingered, what other sleeping seeds lie within you? I felt the air around me change, as though the invisible world leaned closer, waiting to see if I would notice. For the real treasure that night was not the money itself, but the unveiling of a principle so absolute, it makes the laws of men seem like shadows. I began to understand that the 7 words were never about bringing something to me. They were about awakening what I already am. The $1,000 was not created in that moment. It was revealed. And if such a thing could be revealed so swiftly, then perhaps all things are already complete in the unseen, waiting only for your recognition. It is here that most stumble, for they believe manifestation to be the building of something from nothing, when in truth it is the remembrance of what already exists in consciousness. When you live in the end, you are not striving toward a goal, you are resting in the fact that the goal is already accomplished in the mind of God, which is your own imagination. Those 7 words acted like a key, unlocking a door I did not even realize was within me. But once the door opened, I could not unsee what lay beyond it. In the quiet hours after that experience, I began to notice how my thoughts had shifted. There was no longer the frantic grasping, the endless wondering of how or when. Instead, there was a steady knowing, a deep river moving silently beneath the surface of my life. I realized that each time I had truly received something in the outer world, I had first accepted it without question in the inner world. The form might have been money, health, a relationship, or a sudden opportunity, but the law was always the same. Consciousness is the only reality. This was not a phrase to be admired, it was a living fact, and the $1,000 was but a small echo of its truth. That night before sleep, I had entered a state in which the money was mine now, not tomorrow, not after a process, not after proof. Now, I had worn the feeling of the wish fulfilled like a robe, and the robe fit so perfectly that I forgot it was not yet seen by my eyes. This is the essence of living in the end, to so completely assume the state desired that you no longer strain to hold it. You simply are it. In that state, the 7 words were not an affirmation to be repeated, but an expression of the identity I had stepped into. And yet, the outer result was only the surface ripple of something far greater. I began to sense that if every desire could be clothed in this way, fully assumed without doubt, gently rested in until it became natural, then life itself would be an unbroken stream of fulfillment. No delay, no uncertainty, only the continual unveiling of what consciousness has already accepted as true. But this knowing brought with it a holy challenge. Could I release the habit of thinking I must earn or fight for what is mine? Could I rest so deeply in the unseen that I would not be moved by appearances? The truth was clear. If I could do it once, I could do it again, not because of the money, but because the law is no respecter of persons or amounts. A seed produces after its kind, whether that seed is planted for a single coin or an entire fortune. And so the real question became, what new seeds would I dare to plant, knowing now the soil in which they grow? The mind is always planting, with every inner conversation, every idle imagining. The $1,000 was proof that I had, perhaps unknowingly, cultivated the ground well that night. But what if I could plant with intention, with awareness, with the quiet authority of one who knows they are the operant power? Even as these thoughts moved through me, I could feel another realization approaching, one that was not about money at all, but about the nature of the words themselves. For I began to sense that the 7 words had no magic of their own. They were simply a vessel, a shape that carried the living presence of belief. And if that were true, then anything could serve as the vessel, so long as it was filled with the substance of faith. But that knowing carried with it a deeper mystery, one that was about to unfold before me, in ways I could never have anticipated. It became clear to me that the power was never in the syllables, but in the life I breathed into them. Words are but vessels, empty until the spirit of assumption fills them. That night, the 7 words had meaning, because I had already stepped into the reality they described. I had worn them as a garment, invisible to the outer eye, but unmistakable to the inner self. Without that state, the same words spoken 1,000 times would have been nothing more than sound fading into silence. But clothed in conviction, they became flesh, a living decree moving through the unseen. I began to see that everything in life is shaped this way. The form is always secondary, the essence is primary. A cup holds water, not because of its material, but because of its shape, and belief is the shape that holds the substance of things hoped for. The imagination is the mold, and the state you occupy hardens into the image the world will one day display. I understood then why Jesus said, "Out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaketh." What fills your inner world inevitably spills into words, and those words, whether spoken aloud or in the secret chambers of thought, are the seeds from which your reality blooms. That night, I had spoken into being from fullness, not from lack. There was no trace of needing in my tone, no longing in my heart, only the quiet recognition of a truth already mine. This is why the manifestation unfolded so effortlessly. The outer world had no choice but to mirror the inner world I had already accepted as real. The law of assumption does not strain, it simply reflects, and yet most live as if the reflection will change while the face remains the same, not realizing that to alter the mirror, you must alter yourself. The $1,000 was a reflection of a state, and once I saw that clearly, a strange freedom entered my awareness. If the outer world is only the shadow, then I need not fight with shadows. I need only turn my face toward the light of the reality I choose to inhabit, and the shadow will arrange itself accordingly. This is the gentle authority of one who knows the truth. The outer must yield to the inner, always, without exception. I began to watch my inner speech more closely, for I realized it was the constant shaping force of my days. It was not the occasional moment of prayer or affirmation that determined the course of my life, but the continual murmuring within, those silent conversations I had with myself about who I am, what is possible, and what is mine. The 7 words had worked because they were aligned with a sustained inner atmosphere of abundance, however faint it might have been before. And I wondered, with a quiet awe, how much more could be shaped if my inner world were kept deliberately in the state of the wish fulfilled, moment by moment, breath by breath. This awareness stirred something deeper, the recognition that manifestation was never about adding something to me, but revealing the truth of my being. In the eyes of the world, it seemed that I had gained $1,000. In truth, I had simply allowed a version of myself, already whole and already provided for, to step forward into expression. The money was merely the symbol of that identity claiming its place. And if this was so, then every desire was not a call to reach outward, but an invitation to remember inward. I felt the stillness of that revelation settle into me like warm light, and in that quiet I sensed another question rising, one that felt older than time itself. If every desire is already fulfilled in the unseen, and if words are but shapes holding the power of belief, then what is the true origin of those desires? Where do they come from, and why do they appear when they do? This was the thread my spirit longed to follow, knowing that at the end of it lay a truth far greater than money, far greater than any single manifestation, a truth that would change the very way I saw the movements of my own heart. It came to me quietly, like a soft wind through an open window, that every desire carries within it the knowledge of its own fulfillment. It is not random, nor is it born of chance. Desire is the voice of the unseen self, calling you toward the state in which it already lives. The moment you feel the spark of wanting, you are touching the echo of a reality that is already complete. That is why certain longings feel so alive, so electric in your being. They are not fantasies waiting to be built, but messages from the finished work of creation, beckoning you to remember. The $1,000 had not appeared because I forced it into being, but because I answered the call of a state that had already been prepared for me. Those 7 words were not an invention, but a doorway. When I spoke them, I was not asking for something new, I was stepping into what had been waiting from the foundation of the world. That is the mystery most overlooked. Creation is finished. Every possibility exists now, and your task is not to make, but to choose. When this truth begins to settle in you, the strain of manifesting dissolves. You no longer push or plead. You no longer wonder if you are worthy, for the very presence of the desire is proof that the provision is already yours. Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear. Such words cease to be poetry and become law, operating through you as naturally as breath. That night, I did not even fully understand this, yet I was living it. I had aligned myself with the end so completely that the middle had no choice but to fold itself into harmony. This realization began to change the way I moved through the smallest details of life. I started to listen more closely, not with my ears, but with my inner awareness. When a new desire would rise, no matter how small, I would feel for the reality behind it, the place in consciousness where it was already done. Instead of asking, how can I make this happen, I would rest in the question, what would it feel like if this were already so? And the moment the feeling came, I knew the seed had been planted. The $1,000 was simply one harvest, but the field of the inner world is infinite, and every seed planted in the soil of assumption must bring forth after its kind. There is no labor in this kind of sowing, only the quiet choosing of the state you will inhabit. The 7 words worked because they were in perfect agreement with the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Any other words, with the same feeling, would have opened the same door. That is why the outer method can vary endlessly, but the inner law remains unchanged. I began to see how many desires I had once dismissed, telling myself they were unrealistic or untimely, not realizing that in rejecting them, I was turning away from gifts already prepared. The outer world seemed so solid, so convincing in its limitations, but I was learning that it is only the clay. The shape is formed in the unseen, and the clay must yield to the mold. To ignore a true desire is to ignore a part of yourself, and the self is the only power. But there was another layer still, something deeper stirring beneath these revelations. If every desire is already fulfilled in the unseen, then each one is not just an invitation to receive, but a summons to remember who I am. The money, the circumstances, the events, these are only symbols. The real treasure is the awakening to the self that already possesses them. And so I began to ask, not what do I want, but who am I in the having of it? For the state is not about the thing is about the state. As I moved deeper into this way of living, I sensed that the $1,000 experience was meant to be a small yet undeniable signpost, pointing me toward a truth vast enough to transform not just moments, but the entire fabric of my life. And somewhere within me, I knew that to follow this truth would lead me into territories where the old self could not go, places where the line between desire and identity disappears entirely, and only the living awareness of I am remains. The more I sat with that awareness, that the true manifestation is the self who already has, the more the world around me began to soften. Things that once felt urgent lost their grip. I no longer measured time by how close I was to a result, for the result was already mine in consciousness. I began to live in the subtle joy of completion, as if every breath was proof that the end had already been reached. And in this way, I started to see the $1,000, not as a prize won, but as a mirror held up to my identity, reflecting what had always been true. It was then I understood why so many chase results, but never find peace. They remain fixed on the object, believing it will bestow security or worth. But the object is only a shadow. Without the state, it cannot stay. With the state it cannot help but appear. The 7 words had carried me into that state so completely, that the shadow was inevitable. But it was not the shadow that changed me. It was the discovery of the light that cast it. In those days following, I became more deliberate with my inner world. I noticed how easy it was for subtle doubts to creep in, like small foxes in a vineyard. A passing thought of lack, a quick inner image of things going wrong. These were seeds as surely as my 7 words had been, and the Lord does not choose between them, it brings forth what you plant. So I began tending my inner speech as a gardener tends the most delicate blooms. I spoke inwardly only what I desired to see outwardly, not with force, but with the ease of one who knows the soil will yield in season. This was not discipline in the way the world understands it. It was more like devotion, a quiet honoring of the truth that the outer life is the servant of the inner life. Even in ordinary moments, washing dishes, walking down a quiet street, drifting towards sleep, I would let my imagination settle into the scene of the wish fulfilled, not once or twice, but as the natural resting place of my mind. And each time, I could feel the state wrapping itself around me like a familiar garment. The $1,000 had come overnight, because that night I had entered the state without resistance. I had allowed it to be more real than the evidence of my senses. And so it was. That is the only miracle, the willingness to accept the unseen as fact, until the seen must conform. Yet even as I cherished that understanding, I sensed there was more to be uncovered. If the state is the cause of all, then what is the source of the state itself? What is it in us that chooses one garment of being over another? This question lingered in the stillness, like a fragrance that could not be named. I felt that the answer lay not in striving to choose better thoughts, but in recognizing the deeper I that wears them. The $1,000 experience had shown me that I am not the seeker, but the one who already is. And yet how easily we forget this, becoming entangled in the illusions of lack, as though the shadow could dictate to the light. I began to see my desires as sacred messengers, each one pointing me back to my true self. They were not commands to chase something out there, but reminders to awaken to what I am here. Even the desire for money was not about paper or numbers. It was about the feeling of freedom, the knowing of sufficiency, the peace of already having. And if I could rest in that peace without condition, then the form of the desire, whether $1,000 or something far greater, would come of its own accord. This shifted everything. I no longer asked for things to come. I allowed myself to dwell in the being that already holds them. The 7 words had been one doorway,
but I could now feel countless others, waiting for me to step through, and somewhere in the quiet of that realization, I sensed that the greatest doorway of all was not one that led to a single desire fulfilled, but to the full remembrance of the one who fulfills all. It is a strange and beautiful thing to realize that the greatest doorway is not to something, but to someone, the self that is beyond all states, yet wears them as easily as a garment. This self is not hurried, not anxious, not searching, it simply is, and from this still and eternal, I am all forms flow without strain. The $1,000 was only a glimpse, a small reflection of what happens when the outer is allowed to yield to the authority of the inner. But now I could feel that the real work was not to manifest more things, but to abide more deeply in the awareness of who I truly am. When you touch this awareness, the boundaries of time and circumstance begin to dissolve. There is no past to regret, no future to reach for, only the fullness of the end already achieved. You find yourself moving through the world with a quiet assurance, as though you walk in two realms at once, the realm of appearances, ever-changing, and the realm of consciousness, unshakable and whole. And slowly, the first begins to bend to the shape of the second, until the two appear as one. That night with the 7 words, I had unknowingly stepped into that awareness for a moment. I had let go of the identity that seeks and slipped into the one that has. I had tasted the ease of resting in the completed work, and because of that rest, the outer world rearranged itself in perfect obedience. This is the law. The world is yourself pushed out. It can only show you what you are conscious of being. And if you dare to change your conception of yourself, the world will follow without resistance. But here is the quiet challenge. Most will try to change the world without first changing the self. They will plead for the shadow to move, while the light remains fixed. Yet once you understand that the self you accept inwardly is the cause of every effect, the struggle ends. You no longer wrestle with conditions, you assume the feeling of the fulfilled desire, and let the outer echo it in its own way, in its own time. And often, as with my $1,000, that time is startlingly swift. I began to live with a deeper reverence for the states I occupied, knowing that each was a seed with its own appointed harvest. Even fleeting moods took on new significance. A moment of gratitude was no longer just a pleasant feeling, it was a creative act. A lingering thought of limitation was no longer harmless, it was the planting of weeds in the garden of my life. And so my inner world became a place of deliberate choice, not as an act of control, but as an act of alignment. This alignment felt like a gentle returning, as though I were coming home to a place I had never truly left. For the deeper I went into it, the more I realized that the I am within me had never been poor, never been without. The desire for the $1,000 had only been a shadow of the greater truth, that abundance is not a condition to reach, but the nature of the self remembering itself. And if that is so, then no desire is ever truly about the thing sought, but about the unveiling of the one who already holds it. The outer signs are sweet, yes, the unexpected message, the numbers on a screen, the feel of bills in the hand, but they are only symbols, like bread in the wilderness. The real feast is in knowing you are the source from which they come, and that this source is inexhaustible. The moment you know this, the panic of lack dissolves, and you are free to choose from an infinite table, without fear of it ever running dry. And yet even as this truth began to steady my steps, I felt another stirring, the faint awareness that there was a place even deeper than the joy of fulfilled desire, a place where the question of desire itself begins to fade, because the self has moved beyond needing to prove its abundance through form, a place where being itself is the fulfillment, and the world is only its reflection. And I knew that to touch that place would change not only what I manifested, but the very way I understood what it means to live.
It is a rare thing to sense the fading of desire, not through disappointment but through fulfillment so complete it no longer asks to be measured. This is not the numbness of surrendering your hopes, but the quiet saturation of knowing you already are what you once sought to become. It is as though the river you have been chasing suddenly reveals itself beneath your feet, carrying you effortlessly in its current. The $1,000 had been a gentle signpost pointing toward this deeper stream, but the stream itself was something far older, far wider, and entirely without end. When you dwell here, the world loses its power to tempt you into fear. You see that every form is temporary, yet the source from which it flows is eternal. The same presence that gave shape to your desire for money is the one that gives life to every heartbeat, every breath, every unfolding of the day. And because it is yours, because it is you, There is never any real danger of being without. Even in moments when the outer appearance suggests loss, you begin to smile inwardly, for you know the law. The outer is only an echo, and the echo cannot silence the voice. That night with the 7 words, I had unknowingly entered this river, even if only for a moment. I had let go of my grip on the shore of doubt, and allowed myself to be carried by the feeling of completion, and the completion had made itself visible in the form of $1,000. But what mattered more was that I had tasted the stillness beneath all movement, the certainty beneath all appearances. Once you have felt this, even briefly, you cannot go back to believing in the tyranny of circumstance. You begin to understand why the scripture says, "The kingdom of God is within you." It is not a far-off realm you will enter someday, but the very state of consciousness in which all is already given. When you live from this kingdom, there is no need to chase after signs, for the signs follow you. The 7 words were simply the shape I chose that night to step into the kingdom. Tomorrow, it might be a different phrase, an image, a sensation. The form is nothing, the state is everything. From that place, even desire itself changes. It is no longer the restless ache for something missing, but the gentle unfolding of the self into new expressions. You are not reaching for the object. You are expanding into a fuller recognition of who you are. The $1,000 was one such expression, but there was no ceiling to it, no final boundary. In truth, the moment it arrived, it was already complete, and my being was ready to move into yet another state. This is why the practice of living in the end is not a trick to get one thing, but the art of returning again and again to the awareness of already being. And as you rest there, the outer world, like a faithful servant, takes its shape from your command, not the command of force, but the command of assumption. This is the hidden power in every human life, the power most ignore while waiting for circumstances to change of their own accord. The world will call it coincidence, luck or timing, but you will know that the shift always begins in the unseen, in the quiet turning of your inner gaze from what appears to what is. You will know that the outer cannot resist the inner, any more than a shadow can refuse to follow the form that casts it. And once you have seen this, even once, there is a temptation far greater than any desire for money, the temptation to see how far this truth can take you, if you truly dare to live by it. And as I sat in the days after, letting the sweetness of the experience settle deeper into me, I could feel the temptation stirring, not as greed, not as ambition, but as the quiet curiosity of one who has glimpsed an open sky, and wonders how far it stretches. For if 7 words could open the door to one fulfilled desire overnight, then what other doors might yield to the same key? And perhaps even more importantly, what would happen if I learned to live without needing doors at all? It began to dawn on me that the door itself was never real. The 7 words, the scene imagined, even the $1,000, these were simply symbols my mind could accept, bridges carrying me from one state of consciousness to another. But the truth beneath them was unchanged. There is no barrier between you and what you already are. The sense of needing a doorway is only the lingering dream of separation. When that dream dissolves, you realize you are always standing in the very room you sought to enter. This realization brought with it a softness, as though life itself had grown quieter. I no longer felt the urgency to make things happen, nor the weight of wondering whether they would. Instead, I began to rest in the unshakable fact that the state determines the event, and the state is mine to choose. The 7 words had not created the $1,000. They had aligned me with the version of myself for whom it was already natural. The form appeared, because I was no longer contradicting it inwardly. It is here that many misunderstand the law of assumption. They imagine it as effortful affirmations, constant rehearsing, a battle to force the mind into belief. But the law does not respond to struggle. It responds to acceptance. That night, I had accepted without effort. I had moved into the end, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. I had not tried to convince myself. I had simply been it. And in that being, the outer had no choice but to mirror the inner. This is why the teachings say, "Be still and know that I am God." Stillness is not in action. It is the quiet certainty that comes from knowing the work is already finished. When you stand in that awareness, the noise of the outer world loses its power to shake you. You find yourself moving with an ease that feels almost unearthly, as though unseen hands are arranging every step. And indeed they are, for your own consciousness is the arranger, the sculptor, the source. I began to notice that even small, Passing thoughts had a kind of fragrance to them, carrying the seed of the state they belonged to. A thought of doubt felt heavy, closed. The thought of fulfillment felt light, open, expansive. And I realized that my true work was not to push away the closed thoughts, but to dwell so consistently in the open state that the closed could find no place to root. The $1,000 had been born of such an open state, and I could see now that the same openness could carry anything into form. The difference was subtle but profound. I was no longer manifesting to get something, but allowing the outer to reflect who I already was. The 7 words were a reminder, not a request. They drew my attention back to the self that already possessed, and as my attention stayed there, the shadow world of appearances simply obeyed. This is the quiet majesty of the law. It does not strain, it does not falter, it does not forget, it reflects with perfect fidelity. In this I found a strange and holy freedom. If the outer is only a mirror, then I am free to choose my reflection without fear of loss. I am free to live richly in the unseen, knowing that what is lived inwardly will inevitably walk into the light of day. And once you taste this freedom, you begin to see the world, not as a field of obstacles, but as a canvas already waiting for the image you choose to place upon it. Yet even as I rested in this knowing, a deeper invitation stirred. It whispered that there is a level beyond using the law for the shaping of specific things, a level where the shaping is constant, effortless and unthought, because you are so identified with the fullness of being, that you no longer measure it by individual manifestations. It is not that you cease to receive, it is that the receiving becomes as natural and unnoticed as breathing. And I knew that stepping into that place would require me to release even the quiet satisfaction of proof, and trust the unseen entirely. It is a delicate thing, this release of even the need for proof. The mind, trained by years of looking outward for confirmation, resists at first. It whispers, how will you know it is working if you cannot see it? But in the deeper current of being, you realize the question itself belongs to the state of not having. The one who already is, does not look for signs, it moves through life as the sign itself. The $1,000 was one such sign, but its greater purpose was to show me that the self I assumed that night was the true source, and sources do not need evidence to be what they are. In this light, the 7 words were no longer a method, but a doorway into formless identity. I could feel how easily the mind clings to the form, the exact phrase, the specific scene, the precise image, believing that if it repeats them faithfully, the same result will follow. But the law is not in the words, it is in the being. Change the words, change the image, and if the state remains, the result will still come. Keep the words, keep the image, but lose the state, and nothing will follow. That night, I had entered the state without effort, as naturally as slipping into sleep. And perhaps that is why sleep itself is such a sacred gateway in this teaching. In sleep, the grip of the outer loosens, the senses grow quiet, the mind drifts into the fertile soil, where impressions sink deep, unresisted. This is why the feeling of the wish fulfilled is so potent when carried into the threshold of slumber. That night, my 7 words had been the final thought as I crossed into the unseen, and by morning, the unseen had given them flesh. But as I continued to reflect, I realized that even sleep is only a symbol of something greater, the rest of one who lives permanently in the end. It is the Sabbath of the soul, where all labor ceases because all is already done. In this rest, the outer world becomes weightless, no longer a puzzle to solve but a mirror to enjoy. You do not wait for it to change, you watch it reflect what you already are. And because you are not bound to any single desire, your life becomes a continual unfolding of new reflections, each one effortless, each one inevitable. I began to see that the deepest mastery was not in manifesting one thing after another, but in dwelling so steadily in the awareness of completeness that the manifestations no longer served as validation. They were simply natural expressions of an already fulfilled state. Just as the $1,000 had appeared, other forms would appear, not because I chased them, but because I carried the state in which they could not help but appear. This changed the very texture of my days. There was no more urgency in my prayers, no more grasping in my thoughts. When a desire arose, I welcomed it as a gentle reminder of some facet of myself ready to be seen. I stepped into the feeling of already having, not to make it so, but because it was already so in the only place that matters, consciousness. And as I rested there, the outer world rearranged itself with a quiet precision that felt like grace. The beauty of it was in its simplicity.
No complex rituals, no endless effort, only the choice, moment by moment, to inhabit the self who already is. And in this choice, I felt the edges of fear dissolve, for if I could be that self in one moment, I could be it in all moments. And if I could be it in all moments, then the flow of life would never cease, and nothing could be truly lost. Yet beneath even this peace, there was a still deeper whisper, that there is a place beyond the cycle of desire and fulfillment, a place where you no longer translate your being into forms at all, but live in direct communion with the formless source, a place where the 7 words, the $1,000, and every other symbol dissolve into the pure awareness that I am is the only reality. And I could feel myself being drawn toward it, as though the river of being was carrying me to its source. It is a humbling thing to feel yourself drawn upstream, toward the very source from which all desire flows. The closer you come, the more you see that every longing, every imagined scene, every word spoken in faith was a ripple from that fountain. The 7 words that carried me into the $1,000 were not the beginning of creation, they were an echo, and the echo pointed me back to the voice, not the voice of a distant God, but the quiet eternal I am within. As this awareness deepened, the meaning of manifestation itself began to shift. I no longer saw it as the act of bringing something into my life, but as the unveiling of what was always mine in the timeless now. The $1,000 had not traveled toward me from somewhere far away. It had emerged from within the state I dared to assume, and that state, like all states, was simply one garment, worn by the same formless self. The beauty of this is its freedom. When you understand that you are the root and the world is the fruit, you no longer fear the changing seasons, you do not mourn the leaves that fall, or clutch at the blossoms as though they could vanish from their own source. You know that every form will return in season, for the life that gives it shape is endless. In this way, the 7 words became for me not a formula to repeat, but a reminder of the law that cannot fail. It was in the stillness of this understanding that another scripture rose in my mind. All things whatsoever ye shall ask in prayer, believing ye shall receive. I saw then that believing is not a mental effort, not a straining to hold a thought, but the quiet inhabiting of the end as though it were the most natural thing in the world. That night, I had believed without question, because I had felt no separation between myself and the thing desired. We were one, and the outer simply bore witness to that union. This realization softened even the act of desire itself. I began to see each new longing, not as a problem to solve, but as an invitation to remember another facet of my being. If the $1,000 was already in me before I ever named it, then so too was every other good I could imagine. The naming was simply the moment my outer mind caught up to the truth my inner self had always known. And yet the more I lived in this awareness, the more I noticed how subtle the drift can be. A single thought of how or when can pull you back into the state of not having, and the mirror will faithfully reflect it. This is why the watchfulness of the inner world matters, not in the sense of anxious guarding, but in the gentle choosing of the state you will carry. The 7 words worked because they were in harmony with the state I had already allowed to take root. Now, rather than waiting for a specific event to confirm my state, I began to use the state as my confirmation. I would ask myself, am I feeling the completeness of it now? And if the answer was yes, I needed no further sign. The outer would come, as it always does, in its own way, sometimes quickly, as with the $1,000, sometimes slowly, like the growth of a tree, but always without fail, in the likeness of the state assumed. This brought with it a deep rest, a sense that I could live my life from the end without urgency, without fear of loss, for if I could step into the feeling of already having, I could trust the law to bring the shadow into view. And in that trust, there was a quiet joy, the kind that does not depend on outcomes, because it lives in the certainty that the source and the supply are one. Yet even this joy began to point me further inward, for I sensed that the true aim was not to become more skillful in shaping the shadow, but to awaken fully to the light itself, to stand so completely in the awareness of I am, that every manifestation is recognized as only a passing reflection of the one eternal reality. And I knew that the more I turned toward that awareness, the more the world would show me things beyond even the reach of my former desires. The more I turned toward that awareness, the more the outer world seemed to lose its power to define me. It was as if the edges between what I once called me and what I once called my life began to blur. I could no longer see a separation between the doer and the done, between the desire and its fulfillment. Everything that appeared, whether it came as a gift, an opportunity, or even a challenge, felt as though it was rising from the same unbroken sea. The $1,000 had been one small wave upon its surface, but the ocean itself was endless, and I was beginning to know myself as that ocean. From this place, desire began to feel different. It was no longer the restless reaching for what I did not yet have, but the gentle recognition of what was already waiting within. Each longing was a whisper, not of lack, but of readiness. The $1,000 was never about money in the truest sense. It was about ease, about freedom, about knowing that I could lean back into the invisible, and it would hold me without fail. And if it could hold me there, it could hold me anywhere. I started to notice how the law expressed itself even in small, seemingly unimportant things. A casual thought about hearing from a friend, and the message would arrive. A brief imagining of a certain kind of day, and the hours would shape themselves to match it. None of these carried the drama of the $1,000, yet each one was a quiet reminder that the mechanism never changes. Consciousness always reproduces itself in form. The scale of the result matters only to the mind. To the law, all creation is equally effortless. And here, something began to shift in me. I realized that the true art was not in calling forth specific outcomes, but in sustaining a state of being that could only bring forth what I loved. This was not about momentary assumptions, but about identity. The self I accepted as I am, determined not only the money in my hand, but the tone of my days, the quality of my relationships, the very atmosphere of my existence. That night with the 7 words, I had stepped into the self who was provided for, and the outer world had answered in kind. This is why living in the end is so much more than imagining a single scene. It is the continual choice to think, feel, and move as the one who already is. In this way, the end becomes not a point you aim for, but a place you live from. And when you live from it, you find that the path between desire and fulfillment disappears. There is only being, and being needs no bridge, for it has already arrived. The 7 words were simply the language my mind could accept that night, a gentle key to unlock the door to that being. Tomorrow, it might be no words at all, but a simple feeling, a breath, a stillness. The form of the key changes, the lock remains the same, the state you are conscious of being. Turn the key, and the world moves without effort to match it. Leave the lock untouched, and nothing in the outer will shift, no matter how desperately you wish it to. I began to treasure this awareness, more than the manifestations themselves, for with it came the quiet knowing that I was never truly waiting for anything. Even when a desire seemed unfulfilled in the outer, I could rest in the certainty that it was already complete in the unseen, and because I could rest, I could also release. The fear, the urgency, the doubt, these no longer found a home in me. Yet even in this peace, there remained a gentle pull, a sense that I had only begun to explore the depth of what this law could reveal, when applied without limit, without hesitation. If one night, one state, and 7 simple words could so swiftly reorder my world, then what might unfold if I lived every moment in this unbroken awareness of already being? And as that question deepened in me, I knew the answer would not come in theory, but in the living. The answer began to reveal itself, not in a single grand moment, but in the gentle accumulation of days lived from the fullness of being. I found that the more I practiced dwelling in the end, the less I needed to remind myself to do it. It became as natural as breathing, a quiet undercurrent, beneath every thought and movement. I no longer sought to apply the law for specific results alone. I began to live as the one for whom results were simply the natural echo of a chosen state. It was here that I began to notice something extraordinary. When you truly inhabit a state, life does not merely bring you what you have imagined, it weaves for you details, blessings and arrangements far beyond anything you could have scripted. The $1,000 had come exactly as assumed, but it had also arrived wrapped in ease, without the strain of striving, or the burden of repayment. It had brought with it a deeper confidence, an assurance that I was supported not just in that moment, but all. This I saw, was the real gift, the recognition of an unbroken relationship between the inner and the outer. The outer was not a stubborn world to be conquered, but a living mirror, willing to reflect the slightest shift in my inner gaze. If I turned toward abundance inwardly, abundance bloomed outwardly. If I allowed myself to feel lack, lack dutifully appeared. The mirror never argued, never delayed for its own reasons. It simply obeyed the image it was given, and so my attention became the most precious possession I had. Where I allowed it to rest, determined what I would meet in the hours to come. That night, with the 7 words, I had let it rest only on the reality of the wish fulfilled, and the mirror responded instantly. This was not luck or chance, it was the certainty of law. Just as a seed must produce after its own kind, so too must a state bring forth in its likeness. I began to understand why Neville often said that imagining creates reality, not as a metaphor, but as a literal statement of how life unfolds. Every scene I accepted within, every tone of being I allowed myself to feel, was a creation in seed form. The outer world was simply the stage upon which these seeds blossomed into visibility. And just as the gardener does not dig up the soil to see if the seed is growing, I learned to trust the unseen process, without restless checking or doubt. This trust began to change the quality of my desires. They became lighter, freer, untainted by fear. I could rest in the feeling of completion without rushing to see how it would appear. And because I could rest, the appearances often came faster, clothed in the perfect timing and form that I could never have arranged with logic alone. The $1,000 had been swift because I had not interfered with it. I had simply lived in the state where it already was. What struck me most was how the world seemed to conspire on my behalf when I did this. Paths opened, people aligned, circumstances rearranged themselves with quiet precision. None of it required me to force or control. My part was only to remain faithful to the state, to wear it inwardly, until the outer world had no choice but to dress itself in its image. And yet even as I saw this happen again and again, I felt the gentle reminder that these manifestations were still shadows, however beautiful. They were the evidence of the light, but not the light itself. To know the light is to know that you are the source of all that appears, and in that knowing, the grip of desire loosens. You no longer measure your success by what arrives, but by how deeply you remain in the awareness of being. It was toward this awareness that I now felt drawn, not to abandon the joy of creation, but to root myself so completely in the iron that every creation would flow without my conscious effort. And I knew that as I moved into that place, the 7 words that had brought me the $1,000 would become more than a tool. They would become a quiet echo of the greater truth that had been there all along.
It is a quiet but undeniable shift when you begin to see every manifestation as an afterglow rather than the light itself. At first it feels almost backwards. The world teaches you to chase the things you can hold, to value the result over the source. But once you touch the source, even for a moment, you recognize its far greater richness. The $1,000 was a pleasant and tangible proof, yet it was only the shadow of the true event. The moment I accepted without resistance the state in which it was already mine, that acceptance was the real creation. The appearance of the money was simply the natural echo, the shadow compelled to follow the form. And the form, I began to understand, was not the imagined bills or the message in my account, but the inner feeling of already having, the deep unshakable ease of being provided for. That was the state I had worn that night. As I drifted to sleep, the state the 7 words had quietly opened within me. The more I reflected on it, the more I realized how subtle the shift had been. There had been no battle of will, no desperate clinging to belief. It was as if I had simply stopped contradicting myself. All the inner arguments, the questions of how or when, the subtle rehearsals of not having, they had gone silent, and in that silence the assumption took root. It did not grow because I forced it to, but because the soil was clear and open. This is why Neville spoke of pruning the vine, the constant tending of your inner speech, the careful removal of every thought that does not bear the fruit you desire. It is not about endlessly planting new seeds, but about ensuring the ones you have planted are not choked by weeds. That night, I had done it without even knowing. I had let the garden rest, and the seed of the $1,000 blossomed in its appointed hour. From that point on, I became more attentive to the quiet background of my thoughts, not in a fearful way, but with the same calm awareness you might bring to watching the tide. I began to ask, what am I rehearsing inwardly right now? And if I found myself speaking lack, I would not fight it. I would simply return to the feeling of completion, as one returns to a comfortable chair after a brief distraction. This practice changed more than the outer results. It changed me. I found myself walking through the world with a lighter step, no longer scanning for signs that things were working, no longer holding my breath for outcomes. I could rest, knowing that the state itself was the only true evidence I needed. If I was living in the end within, the outer could only follow, whether in hours or in months. The 7 words became, over time, a kind of shorthand, not a magic spell, but a gentle reminder to turn inward, to the state they represented. I would feel them, not as a demand for something to come, but as an acknowledgement of what already was, and from that acknowledgement, life would unfold in ways both ordinary and astonishing. Yet even as I grew more comfortable with this way of being, I could feel another truth stirring beneath it, a truth that whispered of an even deeper rest, one that did not rise and fall with any particular desire fulfilled, a rest in which the self that imagines and the life imagined are seen as one seamless whole, where the river of creation flows continually. Whether or not I stopped to watch each ripple, it was toward that deeper rest that my attention now leaned, not because I wanted to escape the joy of creating, but because I could sense that the joy itself would be fuller there. For in that place, there would be no waiting, no proving, no even subtle measuring of whether the law had worked. There would only be the quiet certainty that it always has, and it always will. And in that certainty, life itself becomes the proof. That deeper rest reveals itself slowly, like the light of dawn spilling over a quiet field. At first you may not notice the change, only that your steps feel lighter, your breath unhurried, your thoughts less tangled. But then you realize that something fundamental has shifted. The old reflex to measure, to compare, to wait for the outer to justify the inner, has faded. You are no longer holding life at arm's length, waiting for proof. You are living inside the proof, because you are living inside the state. The $1,000, in all its precision and swiftness, had been a teacher in disguise. It showed me that the bridge between desire and fulfillment is not built over time, but crossed in a single step, the step of assuming. And once that step is taken, the bridge itself disappears. All that remains is the awareness that you are already where you intended to be. That night, with the 7 words, I stepped without hesitation. I did not linger at the edge wondering if the bridge would hold. I simply crossed, and the crossing was the creation. I began to see this same pattern everywhere. The times when I assumed naturally, without effort or doubt, were the times when life responded most swiftly, and the times when I strained, repeated or begged, even inwardly, were the times when the outer world seemed to hold still. It was never about the amount of work I put in, but about the clarity of the state I inhabited. When I lived in the end lived in me, and the outer world had no choice but to mirror it. This is why the words themselves, though beautiful, were never the true cause. They were a doorway into the state that was the real power. I could have chosen other words, or none at all, and if the state had been the same, the result would have been the same. The law cares nothing for the symbols, it responds only to the reality they carry. And reality, in this sense, is nothing more than the tone of being you have accepted as yourself. Once this truth settled into me, even my smallest thoughts became holy ground. I began to treat them not as idle wanderings, but as seeds, each one carrying the potential to take form. The question was never whether the seed would grow, the law ensures that it will, but whether I was planting from the state I wished to see multiplied. And so my inner world became a kind of sacred garden, not through effort or perfection, but through quiet awareness. I found that this awareness had a softening effect on my entire life. I was no longer impatient for results, because I knew the law could not fail. I was no longer afraid of loss, because I knew the source could not be emptied. The $1,000 had proven this in a form I could hold in my hands, but the real treasure was knowing it did not end there. That same ease could clothe itself as anything: health, companionship, opportunity, for it was never about the thing, but about the state that produced it. And yet there was still a subtle curiosity in me, a gentle wondering of what might happen if I could live this way without lapse, without the small forgettings that pull the mind back into lack. What would life look like if every moment were lived from the fullness of being, not as an effort, but as the only way I knew how to exist? I could feel the possibility of it, as one feels the warmth of the sun before it crests the horizon. It was a possibility that called not for striving, but for surrender, the kind of surrender that lets go of every question, every need to see, every urge to control, and simply abides in the knowing. For in that knowing, the outer world has no power but to echo the truth you have already claimed. And the more I tasted of that truth, the more I knew it was leading me to something far greater than the fulfillment of any single desire. It is a quiet paradox that surrender is the very thing that makes the law seem most effortless. The moment you release the need to watch over the seed, the soil takes over, and life begins to work in ways your reason could never orchestrate. That night with the 7 words, I had surrendered without knowing I was doing it. I had not checked the clock of reality, wondering when the harvest would come.
I had simply let the feeling of completion carry me into sleep, and in the stillness of that surrender, the $1,000 found its way into form. This surrender is not resignation, it is not the weary giving up that the world often calls acceptance. It is the vibrant living trust that comes from knowing the work is already finished. It is the willingness to abide in the end without needing the outer to prove it to you. And it is in this space that the law moves with the greatest ease, arranging every detail with the precision of a master craftsman. I began to notice how my earlier attempts at manifestation had been filled with a subtle tension, a constant glancing over my shoulder to see if the result was coming, a hidden fear that perhaps it would not. But the $1,000 had arrived without that tension, and this difference was not in the words I spoke, but in the self I had been willing to be. I was no longer the one reaching for it, I was the one for whom it was already natural. And because I had accepted that identity, the world had no choice but to agree. This is the mystery hidden in the simple phrase, according to your faith be it unto you. Faith is not a grim holding on, it is the effortless resting in the truth that what you have assumed is already so. The 7 words that night were not my faith, they were the expression of it, they were the shape my acceptance took, the garment in which the state clothed itself for a moment. But it was the state that did the work. As this sank deeper into me, I realized that the outer form of the desire was almost irrelevant. The $1,000 could have arrived in a dozen different ways, and it would not have mattered. What mattered was that the state had been fulfilled inwardly first. From that fulfillment, the outer form became inevitable, just as a shadow is inevitable when the object stands in light. And once you grasp this, you stop worrying about the how, because the how is always born from the state itself. I began to play with this in small quiet ways. I would take an ordinary desire, a certain conversation, a peaceful day, a simple gift, and instead of asking for it or planning it, I would step into the version of me for whom it was already complete. Sometimes I used words, sometimes only a feeling, sometimes an image, and each time, the outer world would rise to meet it, often in ways so natural that had I not been aware, I might have thought it coincidence. But there are no coincidences in the law, there is only the reflection of the self you have dared to be. And as I saw this unfold again and again, the truth became impossible to ignore. The inner always precedes the outer, and the outer never fails to mirror the inner. This is not an occasional miracle, it is the constant operation of life. The $1,000 had been a clear and striking example, but now I began to see that everything, every meeting, every word spoken to me, every circumstance, was the echo of some state I had occupied. This realization carried with it a strange kind of power, not the power to force events, but the power to choose myself. And in choosing myself, I was choosing the world I would walk into. Yet even as I rested in this power, a deeper question began to rise, not about what I could manifest, but about how completely I could live in the awareness that I was never separate from what I desired. For if I could hold that awareness, without faltering, I sensed there would come a moment when even the act of assuming would dissolve, and only the pure knowing of I am would remain. It is a subtle turning, when the focus shifts from what you can create, to the recognition that you and the creation are not two. At first it feels as though you are reaching outward, shaping life from a distance, but the more you live in the end, the more you see that there is no distance at all. The desire and its fulfillment rise from the same place, the same I am that has never been divided. The $1,000 had seemed to come from somewhere beyond me, but in truth it had emerged from the same awareness in which I sat that night, speaking 7 quiet words into the silence. When you touch this, the habit of striving begins to dissolve. You no longer picture the wish fulfilled as something apart from you, you feel it as your own being. It is as if the gap between imagining and having disappears, because you see that the imagining was the having all along. The outer form becomes only the evidence, the natural consequence of a truth that has already been lived within. This is why the law responds so faithfully. It is not granting requests from afar, but reflecting the reality you have claimed as yourself. That night, I had claimed provision. I had not asked for it. I had been it. And in the morning the mirror of the world showed me what I had worn. This is the difference between hoping and assuming, between wishing and being. The first waits for the world to move. The second moves the world by being the change itself. I began to realize that every assumption carries its own world within it. Step into the state of wealth, and an entire pattern of life unfolds from it. The thoughts you think, the choices you make, the way others respond to you. Step into the state of lack, and a different pattern emerges just as faithfully. The outer is not random, it is the inevitable shadow cast by the state you stand in. And once you see this, you understand that changing the shadow requires no effort at all, you simply turn toward a different light. This understanding made the act of assumption feel lighter, freer. I no longer treated it as a task to complete, but as a garment to try on. If I wished to experience something new, I would slip into the feeling of already having it, letting it rest on me until it felt natural. The outer would follow in its time, but my peace no longer depended on when or how it came. My peace came from knowing it was already mine, for in consciousness, it had always been. The $1,000 was only one instance of this truth, but it was enough to reveal that the process never changes. Whether the desire is small or great, whether it arrives in hours or in years, the cause is always the same, the state assumed. And so my attention shifted away from chasing outcomes and toward sustaining the state, not as a temporary technique, but as a way of living. And yet, as I grew more comfortable here, I began to sense another layer beneath even this. It was the faint recognition that the self who assumes is itself an assumption, that the I who wears wealth, health, or love, is still only a form of the formless. If I could step beyond even these garments, what would I find? What would it mean to live as the awareness in which all states appear and disappear, untouched, unbound? That question did not come with urgency, but with a calm pull, like the tide drawing gently toward the deeper sea. I knew that if I followed it, the joy of creation would not vanish, but it would be joined by something greater, the unshakable peace of knowing that before the $1,000, before the 7 words, before any imagined scene, the I am was already whole. And perhaps that was the truest manifestation of all. The more I leaned into that question, the more I could feel the stillness behind it. It was not the stillness of inactivity, but the stillness of something complete, whole, untouched by the coming and going of forms. The $1,000, the 7 words, the ease with which it arrived, all of it seemed now like waves rising and falling on the surface of a vast ocean, and the ocean was not concerned with the shape of the wave, for it knew itself as the water beneath them all. In moments of quiet, I would sit with this awareness. I would let the forms I had once held so tightly begin to dissolve in my mind. I would imagine them fading, not in loss, but in merging back into the formless light from which they came. And as they dissolved, I noticed that nothing in me was truly diminished. The peace remained, the being remained, the I am remained. This was the part the world never teaches, that before the thing is named, before the desire is felt, you already are the source of it. It was as though I had spent years playing with reflections, marveling at how they changed when I moved, but never realizing that I was not the reflection at all. The 7 words had worked because they aligned me with a reflection I desired to see. But now I began to understand that the true freedom was not in endlessly changing the reflection, but in remembering the light that made all reflection possible. When this awareness deepens, the way you use the law changes. You still imagine, you still assume, you still live in the end, but you do it with the lightness of one who knows the game. You no longer plead with the mirror, nor fear that the image will fade. You turn inward to the self that casts it, and from there you choose. And because you choose from wholeness, rather than from lack, everything you select is flavored with ease. That night, I had chosen the self who already had $1,000. I had stepped into it without hesitation, and the world had reflected it as faithfully as water mirrors the moon. But now I saw that I could step into any self, not as a means to get, but as an expression of what I already am. This was creation not as striving, but as play, and in that play, there is a joy purer than the form it produces. It was here that a verse returned to me with new meaning. Before Abraham was, I am. I had heard it countless times before, but now I felt it. The I am precedes all states, all names, all stories. It wears them for a time, and then lays them aside, yet it remains unchanged. The $1,000 was a garment worn for a moment, just as other desires would be, but the one wearing them is eternal, and to know this is to find the rest that no manifestation alone can give. This realization did not pull me away from the joy of imagining. If anything, it made it sweeter. For now I could imagine, without fear of failure, without the hidden weight of needing the result to prove the law was real. I knew the law was real, because I knew myself. The 7 words were no longer just a memory of something I had done. They were a reminder of the truth I had always been living, whether I recognized it or not. And yet even in this peace, there was a gentle sense that the story was still unfolding, that the law, the self, the source and the reflections, were all part of a greater whole I had only begun to touch. I could feel that stepping further into this awareness would not diminish the beauty of creation, but would reveal an even deeper beauty beneath it, one that could never be spent, never be lost, and never depend on the shifting shadows of the outer world. The deeper beauty is that nothing you have ever manifested was truly separate from you, even the desires that seemed to come from nowhere, even the blessings that appeared unasked for, they were all movements of the same self, rising into form for a season. The $1,000, though it arrived swiftly, and with such clarity, was not an act of the world giving to me, it was the world revealing me to myself. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. It begins to change how you look at everything. No longer do you treat the outer as cause and the inner as effect. You see the outer as the echo, the shadow, the mirror, and you stop trying to rearrange it by force. The $1,000 could not have arrived without the state that made it inevitable, and that state could not have been entered without my willingness to be it before I saw it. This is the quiet secret. The world meets you at the level of your assumption, not your effort. From here, life becomes a constant invitation to choose your state. Each moment is a fork in the road, not between action and inaction, but between identifying with what you want, or with what you fear. That night, my 7 words were not a strategy, they were a declaration of identity. I had become the one who already had what I desired, and in becoming that one, I had left no room for contradiction. This is why the law is so exact. It cannot give you what you are not conscious of being. You may long for it, dream of it, speak of it endlessly, but if you persist in the state of not having, the mirror will reflect that state with perfect fidelity. Change the state, and the reflection must change, for it has no will of its own. I began to see how gently this could be applied to anything, a desired outcome in work, a healing in the body, harmony in a relationship. The principle did not shift. I would ask myself, who am I in the having of this? And then let that answer wrap itself around me until it felt like my natural skin. No forcing, no bargaining, just the quiet inhabiting of the end. And without fail, the outer would rearrange itself in obedience to the state. But something else began to happen too. The more I lived this way, the less I was interested in measuring the speed or the size of the results. The satisfaction was already present in the state itself. If the outer had to catch up, I could wait, because I was not waiting empty-handed. I was already in possession, already at rest. This was a peace the world could not offer, for it did not depend on the outer being perfect before I could feel whole, and perhaps that was the truest gift the $1,000 had given me, not the form itself, but the glimpse of a life lived entirely from fullness, a life where nothing is sought to fill a gap, because no gap is recognized, a life where creation flows as naturally as breath, and the joy is in the being, not just the having. Yet even as this truth settled deeper into me, I sensed there was still more to see. For if every manifestation is an expression of the self, and if the self is infinite in possibility, then what I had experienced so far was only the faintest beginning. There was a depth to this law, and a depth to my own being, that I had only begun to touch, and I could feel it calling me to step further in.
It is a curious thing to feel that call, not as a demand, not as a restless urge, but as a quiet pull, like the tide drawing you toward deeper waters. The $1,000 had been a surface wave, beautiful in its rise, but the current beneath it hinted at something far greater. That current was the truth, that the outer world is never separate from the inner self, and that what appears in form is only the visible tip of an infinite invisible whole. The more I lingered in this awareness, the more I began to sense that every desire was simply an entry point, a doorway into the recognition of the self. The money, the relationships, the opportunities, each one was a symbol, a pointer toward a deeper knowing. They were not ends in themselves, but signposts along a path leading always inward. That night with the 7 words, I had crossed a threshold without realizing it. I had stepped, however briefly, into the place where the desire and the fulfillment were one and the same. And once you have touched that place, even for a moment, it changes how you see everything. You no longer chase the shadow, for you know the light that casts it. You no longer plead with the mirror, for you understand that the reflection has no power apart from the face it imitates. You begin to move through life with a different rhythm, slower in one sense, for there is no more urgency, yet swifter in another, for there is no hesitation. This is the beauty of living in the end. The journey collapses into the destination. The $1,000 had not been earned in the outer sense. It had been accepted inwardly. The acceptance was the real work, and it was a work done in stillness, without effort. The world, as it always does, simply followed the blueprint given to it by consciousness. It became clear to me that the law does not know scale. To it a penny and a fortune are the same, for both are merely forms shaped by the state assumed. The 7 words had not been heavy with strain. They had been light with certainty. They did not ask for the money. They embodied the self who already possessed it. That difference is the hinge upon which the entire law turns. From this place, I began to practice choosing states not for their outcomes, but for the way they felt to live in. I would step into the self who was at peace, or the self who was joyful, or the self who was deeply loved, not because I needed proof in the outer, but because I wished to dwell there now. And without fail, the outer world would rearrange itself to match the choice, often in ways so seamless, they felt like life had always been that way. The $1,000 was one such arrangement. But what struck me most, looking back, was how little thought I had given to the how. I had not planned a path for it to arrive. I had not traced the steps it would take. I had simply known it was already here in the only place that matters, the inner place. And because I had known it there, it had no choice but to appear where my senses could witness it. Yet even this felt like only a glimpse of something deeper, something that could not be measured in amounts or timelines. I began to wonder what life might be if every moment were lived from that knowing, if there were no lapse between the awareness of having and the expression of it. What if the 7 words were not just a tool for a single desire, but a constant unbroken song of being? And as that thought settled in me, I felt the quiet certainty that this was where the real journey was leading. It is a rare kind of freedom, when the act of assuming ceases to be an occasional practice, and becomes the quiet atmosphere you live in. The 7 words that once belonged to a single night began to dissolve into something larger, something that was less about language, and more about being. I no longer reached for them, only when I wanted to bring something into form. They became the tone of my inner world, the unspoken posture of my heart. And in that shift, I began to see the subtle truth that the state itself is the destination. The money, the relationship, the opportunity, these are the shadows the light casts, but the light is the state of consciousness you have chosen to wear. That night the light was provision, the quiet knowing that my needs were already met. The $1,000 was the shadow, perfect in its outline, but powerless without the light that produced it. This is why so many, even when they receive what they have imagined, find themselves still searching. The shadow can satisfy for a time, but without the light it fades quickly. The true fulfillment is in knowing that the source is within you, that you can choose at any moment to dwell in the state from which the shadow flows. That is the wealth no outer form can take away. I began to test this in ways so small, they seemed almost inconsequential. The feeling of warmth on a cool morning, the ease of an unexpected kindness, the joy of a task completed without strain. I would step into the state before the moment arrived, wearing it as naturally as I wore my own skin, and without fail, the outer would arrange itself to reflect what I had already accepted inwardly. The mechanics were the same, whether the desire was grand or simple. The law did not distinguish. The more I lived like this, the less I felt bound by the notion of time. I could feel the end before the beginning had even unfolded in the outer world, and because I could feel it, I knew it was already mine. This knowing stripped away the old habits of waiting, of watching for signs, of measuring how close I was. I understood that the distance between me and what I sought existed only in thought, and the moment I removed that thought, the distance vanished. That night with the 7 words, I had unknowingly removed all distance. I had not placed the fulfillment in some far-off tomorrow. I had brought it into the now, and the now had shaped itself accordingly. This is the power of living in the end. You remove the gap between desire and possession, and life must reflect that removal. And yet beneath this practical working of the law, I began to feel a deeper current moving. It was the realization that even the state I chose was not the final truth. Beyond the state was the awareness that chose it. Beyond the $1,000 was the I that had worn provision so completely that the money had appeared, and that I was not limited to any single role, not bound to any one story. The verse returned to me again. I am the light of the world. The outer world, with all its forms and changes, was only ever lit by the awareness I carried. Without the light, there could be no reflection. And the more I contemplated this, the more I felt the invitation to live not merely as one who assumes a state, but as the light itself, the source of all states, all stories, all shadows. I could feel that such a way of living would not erase the joy of creating, but would deepen it. It would free me from the subtle fear of losing what I had gained, because I would know that the source could never be diminished. And in that knowing, the 7 words would become more than a tool. They would become an expression of the eternal truth, that I am precedes, sustains and outlasts everything it brings into form. To live as the light itself is to stop thinking of creation as a series of separate events. You no longer measure one manifestation against another, nor do you weigh the worth of the form by its size or speed. Everything becomes a movement of the same radiance. Each expression is natural as the turning of the seasons. The $1,000 had seemed in that moment like a single miraculous occurrence, but from the vantage of the light, it was simply one more reflection in an unending stream of reflections. Beautiful, yes, but no more difficult for the light to cast than the glow upon a single drop of dew. This realization loosened something in me. I no longer felt the need to summon a particular outcome with the carefulness I once had. Instead, I began to rest in the awareness that the outcome was always inherent in the state, and the state was always mine to choose. If I could wear it inwardly, it would wear itself outwardly, without my managing it. The 7 words had been my way of slipping into the garment of provision that night. Another time, it might be a picture, a single feeling, or even the silence itself, and the silence began to reveal its own richness. In the absence of words, there was no loss of power. If anything, the silence carried an even greater certainty, for it was free of all the noise of effort. It was simply being, the kind of being that knows without needing to declare. I began to see that the law responds just as faithfully to this unspoken knowing as it does to the most vivid inner scene. The form is for the mind. The law answers to the state alone. I thought again of that night. What had truly happened was not that I had done something extraordinary, but that I had stopped doing what hindered me. I had ceased rehearsing lack. I had ceased asking when and how. I had ceased trying to bridge the gap without a means. And in ceasing, I had allowed the gap to vanish entirely. The 7 words had been the final thought before the descent into sleep, but it was the state they represented that did the work. The more I contemplated this, the more it felt inevitable, not as a rigid law, but as a truth so natural it could not be otherwise. Just as a seed knows to grow in its appointed way, the state knows to produce after its own kind, and in the same way that the seed contains the full pattern of the tree, the state contains the full pattern of the life that will follow from it. When you know this, you stop forcing the branches and simply choose the seed. The $1,000 had been one seed, chosen and accepted without resistance, but I began to realize that I could plant seeds continuously, even playfully, without the strain of needing to see them grow before I could rest. Rest came first, and from rest growth was inevitable. This reversed the way I had once approached life. Instead of waiting for proof to feel secure, I felt secure, and let the proof arise in its own time. And there, in that reversal, was the deeper gift. It was no longer about holding on until something happened. It was about living as though it already had. The peace was immediate, the joy present now, the freedom already mine. The $1,000 had come overnight, but the greater wealth was the discovery that I could live in the state of any fulfillment before it ever took form, and in doing so, I was never without it. Yet even as this understanding deepened, I could sense a further unfolding. For if all forms are shadows of the state, and the state itself is chosen within the light of I am, then the truest mastery is not merely in choosing well, but in knowing the chooser. And I felt that to know the chooser completely would be to stand in a place where the need to choose at all begins to fade. What lies beyond that place, I could not yet name, but I could feel it drawing nearer. To sense the chooser is to stand at the still point from which all movement begins. It is the awareness that watches the rise and fall of every state, the silent witness untouched by what it wears. The $1,000 had been the fruit of a state. I stepped into that night, but the one who stepped, the quiet I, remained unchanged whether the state bore fruit or not. And this was the deeper revelation. You are not the state, nor the shadow it casts, but the awareness that gives both their life. When this truth begins to take root, the urgency that once drove desire softens. You no longer cling to the outcome as proof of who you are. You know who you are before the outer answers, and so the answer becomes simply another reflection, one more confirmation of what was already true. The law continues to operate, as faithfully as ever, but you use it now,
with the ease of one who knows the source can never be diminished. I thought of that night with the 7 words, how naturally they had flowed, how easily the state had wrapped itself around me. There had been no calculation, no weighing of probabilities. I had not tried to convince myself. I had simply accepted, and perhaps that acceptance had been possible only because, in that moment, my senses were quiet, my mind was still, and the inner was clear. In that clarity, the assumption felt inevitable. It showed me something essential. The law is not about struggle, but about clarity. The seed germinates best in untroubled soil. When you quiet the noise of doubt, you give the assumption space to take root. That night, the stillness before sleep became my fertile ground, and the state of provision was planted so deeply that by morning it had broken through into visibility. The simplicity of it was almost startling. The $1,000 had not come because I had mastered some complex method, but because I had, without resistance, become the self who already possessed it. The 7 words were not the magic, they were the doorway. The magic was in walking through without hesitation, and staying there until the world had no choice but to follow. This awareness began to reshape how I approached every desire. Instead of asking, how will it happen, I asked, who am I when it has already happened? And then I stepped into that self, not as a performance, but as a truth. I noticed that when I did this lightly, with no strain, the outer world moved with astonishing speed. When I did it with tension, as though trying to force the echo to appear, the reflection came slowly or not at all. It was as if life was showing me, again and again, that the one thing required was the assumption itself, alive, natural, sustained until it felt like second nature. The 7 words had been my bridge that night, but I could feel now that there were infinite bridges, all leading to the same place, the state of the wish fulfilled. And every time I crossed, I was reminded that the crossing itself was the creation. Yet the more I lived this way, the more I sensed a greater unfolding. If the chooser is untouched by any state, then perhaps the ultimate freedom is not in moving from state to state, but in resting entirely in the chooser, the pure I am, that precedes every image and every form. And in that resting, I felt there might be a peace deeper than even the joy of fulfillment, a peace that comes from knowing that nothing ever needs to be added to what you already are. It is here, in the still recognition of I am, that desire itself begins to feel different. It no longer arrives as a cry for what is missing, but as a gentle movement of the infinite expressing itself through you. You see it not as a demand to be fulfilled, but as a song already complete, playing quietly within, waiting only for you to lean in and hear it. And when you hear it clearly, you realize it is not separate from the awareness that hears. The desire and the self are one, and in that unity, the manifestation is as natural as breathing. The night of those 7 words now shone in my memory with this understanding. I had believed then that I was asking for something to be brought to me, but in truth, I had been allowing what was already mine to rise into visibility. The $1,000 had existed as surely as the moon exists behind the clouds. The words I spoke were not a request to create the moon, but an acknowledgement that it was already there, ready to be seen when the veil lifted. This shift dissolved the sense of waiting. If the reality already exists within, then to live as if it were not yet here, is to deny the truth. And so the work, if we can call it work, is to align the feeling of now with the knowing of already. The outer will catch up, because it has no life of its own. It only reflects the inner pattern it is given. As Paul wrote, we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are unseen. For the unseen is the seed, and the seen is its shadow. Once this truth is felt deeply, you stop glancing over your shoulder to check whether the shadow has formed. You remain in the light, and the shadow must appear. That night, in the moments before sleep, I had rested so completely in the feeling of having that sum, that I could not have told you whether the bank had it yet or not. It no longer mattered. The reality was real, because I was living it inwardly, and that was the only place it could ever be born. And in this resting, I began to notice something else, a softness in the way life moved. Events would arrange themselves without my prompting. Conversations would drift toward opportunity, without my steering them. Even apparent delays seemed to serve a hidden order, revealing outcomes richer than the ones I had first imagined. I saw, over and over, that the law does not require my interference, it requires my faithfulness to the state. Faithfulness is not hard labor, it is the quiet art of remembering, of returning, of refusing to be persuaded by the appearance of absence. When doubt whispers, faithfulness answers with the feeling of already. When fear presses in, faithfulness wraps itself again in the garment of fulfillment. The $1,000 came because I wore that garment as though it were my skin, even in sleep. And by morning, the world had conformed. Yet the more I lived in this way, the more a new question formed in me, not the old question of will it happen, but something subtler, deeper. If all is truly within, and I can assume any state at will, then what is it that chooses which states to inhabit? And if I could see that choosing clearly, might I step into a freedom so vast, that even desire itself becomes something wholly transformed? The chooser reveals itself in quiet moments, when you are neither chasing nor resisting, when the mind has loosened its grip on the outcome, and rests in bare awareness. It is there you notice that the movement into a state is not a random occurrence, but a deliberate act, though so swift and subtle, that it often hides behind the veil of habit. Most live as though the world forces states upon them, not realizing they are the ones clothing themselves in them, moment by moment. That night with the 7 words, I had stepped into a state without doubt or delay, but it was not chance. It was the fruit of many small choices before it. Choices to turn inward instead of outward, to believe the unseen instead of the visible, to accept the feeling instead of the facts. And in the silence of those choices, the chooser grew strong. You begin to see that the chooser is not swayed by the evidence of the senses, because it knows that the senses are only mirrors. It acts not in reaction, but in creation. It does not wait for the reflection to change before it moves. It moves, and the reflection must follow. This is why Scripture says, "Call those things which be not as though they were," for the act of calling is the act of choosing, and the world answers only to the call it is given. There is great tenderness in discovering this. You realize you are never trapped, never at the mercy of conditions, because the state is always yours to select. Even when you feel bound by circumstance, the door to another state is open, waiting for you to walk through. And the walking is nothing more than the inward acceptance that you already are what you choose to be. I think now of how many times before that night I had rehearsed lack without knowing it, holding conversations in my mind that affirmed what I did not want, reacting to the shadow instead of the light. I see clearly that when the $1,000 came, it was not because the law had suddenly begun to work, but because I had finally used it faithfully. The law had always been there, waiting, reflecting exactly what I had been assuming. This is why the 7 words carried power, not because of their sound, but because of the self from which they were spoken. They were not the cry of one in want, they were the declaration of one already in possession, and so the world obeyed. Once you taste this, the hunger to choose deliberately grows. You stop wandering from state to state by accident, and begin to dwell in the ones that serve your highest knowing. You find yourself revising memories, not to escape the past, but to reshape its meaning, clothing yourself even in your own history, with the garments of fulfillment. And as the past shifts in feeling, the future bends to match it, for both are only the shadows of the present assumption. And yet in the deepening of this practice, another layer reveals itself, a whisper that perhaps even the act of choosing is only a surface expression of something greater, a movement of the eternal I am that contains all states already, in perfect rest. What would it mean to stand not only as the one who chooses, but as the source from which every choice flows?
To stand as the source is to discover that every state you have ever entered, every desire you have ever held, was already contained in you from the beginning. You are not traveling toward them, you are unfolding them. Just as the oak sleeps within the acorn, so every possible version of you rests quietly within the eternal. I am waiting for the warmth of your attention to awaken it. The act of choosing, then, is not about summoning something from beyond yourself, but about uncovering what has been hidden in plain sight. When I allowed those 7 words to rise from within, I was not pulling a future into being. I was allowing the layer of reality that matched them to become visible. The $1,000 was not far away. It was here, but unseen, waiting for me to stand in the light where it could be revealed. And the light was the feeling of already having it. That light, once turned on, cannot help but cast its reflection into form. The mind will often resist this, for it has been trained to believe in time that cause must precede effect by days or months or years. But the cause is not time-bound, it is state-bound. The moment the state is assumed, the effect begins to crystallize, and its appearance in the outer world is simply the last stage of a process that began within. This is why the manifestation of the $1,000 felt so sudden. It was not sudden at all. It was the visible edge of an invisible shift that had already taken place. Living as the source changes your relationship with desire. You no longer plead with the unseen. You commune with it. You no longer wonder if your wish will be answered. You rest in the knowing that it has been answered from the instant it was conceived. The gap between desire and fulfillment collapses inward until you find there is no gap at all. It is here that the practice deepens into stillness. When you feel yourself as the source, you are not compelled to strain or force. You do not check the outer world for signs, because you understand that signs are the echo, not the origin. You remain in the state as naturally as you remain in your own skin. And from this quiet, life arranges itself with a precision that is almost playful. Unlikely channels open. Perfect timing unfolds without your planning. The pieces move into place because they are responding to the law, and the law is responding to you. I began to see this in other areas of my life. Small things at first, a conversation shifting in my favor, an opportunity surfacing where there had been none, unexpected kindness arriving without my seeking it. These were not random. They were the natural consequence of dwelling in the awareness that all good already exists within me. And with each instance, the truth of it sank deeper, until I no longer wondered whether the next desire would come. I knew. Yet as the knowing deepened, another question stirred in the quiet. If all states already live within, and I am the source from which they arise, then what is the truest state I can abide in? Is there a state beyond the fulfillment of any single desire? A state in which I rest not in what I have, but in what I eternally am? It is one thing to dwell in the feeling of a fulfilled desire, and another to rest in the awareness from which all desires spring. The first brings the sweet fragrance of a single blossom. The second reveals the entire garden. When you abide in the deeper state, you no longer identify yourself with the ebb and flow of specific outcomes. You rest in the unshakable knowing that nothing can be added to you, and nothing can be taken away. This is the place Jesus pointed to when he said, "Before Abraham was I am." He was not speaking of age or time, but of the eternal identity untouched by circumstance. It is here you realize that the $1,000, the healed body, the restored relationship, all of these are but leaves on the tree of your being. To pluck one is pleasant, but to know yourself as the root is freedom. The shift into this state is subtle, like moving from the bright light of midday into the golden glow of evening. You may still carry desires, but they no longer carry you. You hold them lightly, as a musician holds a note, knowing it will fade into silence, and another will rise. Your joy is not in the note itself, but in the music that flows through you unceasingly. In the days after the $1,000 appeared, I would return in thought to the moment those 7 words first took root. I saw now that it was not the words themselves, nor even the image they evoked, but the stillness in which they were spoken. That stillness was the real treasure. It was the infinite space in which all form could take shape without resistance. To live in this way is to walk as one who is already home. You do not hurry. You do not doubt. When a desire arises, you meet it with the gentle assurance that it is already complete, and your only task is to let it bloom in its appointed hour. You no longer fight the soil, or pull at the seed. You water it with quiet gratitude, and you let the unseen sun do its perfect work. And in this posture, something remarkable begins to happen. The need for proof dissolves. You stop counting the days. You stop measuring the distance between you and what you seek. Your mind becomes like a calm sea, untroubled by wind or wave, reflecting only what you choose to behold. And because you behold it with such quiet certainty, the outer world has no choice but to conform. Yet in the gentle rhythm of this life, a deeper realization begins to whisper, a realization that asks, if all things are already mine, and I am complete before any desire is born, then what is this longing that continues to arise? What is this divine urge that keeps calling me forward, not to gain, but to remember? And could it be that every fulfilled desire is not an ending, but a signpost pointing me back to the truth I have always been? It is here you begin to see that desire itself is not an enemy to be subdued, nor a chain to be broken, but a messenger from the unseen, carrying a reminder of what you already are. Each longing is a fragment of your own being, calling to be recognized and embraced. The $1,000 was not a gift from outside, but a reflection of the abundance that had been quietly waiting within, unacknowledged until those 7 words opened the door. This is why you find, as you walk more deeply in the law, that the form of the desire matters less than the awareness it unveils. At first you think it is the money that will bring freedom, the reconciliation that will bring peace, the healing that will bring joy. But when the thing appears, you discover the joy was never in the thing, it was in the recognition of your own creative power, the quiet astonishment that your inner whisper could bend the outer world. And yet something even subtler begins to emerge, when you linger in that astonishment. You realize that every creation is but a shadow of the real work, the shaping of yourself into the likeness of your assumption. When you assume wealth, you are not simply drawing coins into your hand, you are remembering yourself as the one who cannot lack. When you assume love, you are not coaxing affection from another, you are awakening as the embodiment of love itself. The outer is only the echo of the inner song. I remember lying awake after the deposit appeared, feeling no rush to spend it, no urgency to prove it real. Instead there was a strange stillness, as though I had stepped into a wider room where time did not press. I could feel, as one feels the weight of a warm blanket, the truth that all I had done was accept myself as the one for whom such a thing was natural. That state, not the bank balance, was the treasure. It was then I understood why Neville would say, "Be still and know that you are God." The stillness is not the absence of motion, but the absence of division. It is the end of the subtle argument that says you must wait, or work, or earn before you can have. In the stillness, there is only one voice, and it speaks only in the language of already done. From that place, life becomes a gentle unfolding. You do not need to strain to create. You simply dwell in the conviction of your chosen reality, until the world arranges itself accordingly. You may watch the old shadows fade, but you do not mourn them, for you know they were never the truth, only reflections of an earlier state, now released. And in this quiet mastery, another question stirs, like a bird shifting in the branches before dawn. If my every desire is but a mirror of my own being, then what is the highest image I dare to hold? What form could I take within myself that would leave no room for lack, no shadow of fear, and no memory of separation? It is in that very question that the soul begins to stretch beyond the small boundaries of personal gain into the infinite landscape of being. For if all creation is but the reflection of your assumed self, then the truest work is not to gather shadows, but to choose the light you cast. This is the quiet turning of the heart from asking, "How can I get this?" to declaring, "This is who I am." The outer ceases to be the goal, and becomes instead the effortless consequence of your inner stance. When I asked myself what form I dared to hold, I found my mind at first offering images of safety, comfort and ease. They were lovely, but still tethered to the old belief that I was something small in need of protecting. It was only when I let those images dissolve into formless light, that I began to sense the grandeur of a state unchained from any condition. There I was not someone possessing wealth, but wealth itself. Not someone experiencing love, but love made visible. Not someone receiving life, but life in its fullness, flowing radiant, without end. This was not imagination as daydream, not a fantasy to escape into, but the deliberate acceptance of a higher identity, and in that acceptance, all lower states bowed in quiet surrender. It was as though the $1,000, once a dazzling miracle, now stood as a small token in a much vaster treasury. For what is a single coin to the ocean from which it comes? What is one answered desire to the fountain that cannot run dry? I began to walk through my days with a subtle but unshakable knowing. I do not seek, I do not chase, I do not chase, I do not wonder if it will come. I am. This is the essence of living in the end, to wear the garment of your fulfilled state so completely, that you forget there was ever a time you were without it. And in that forgetting, you are free. This is why the Master's words hold such power. According to your faith be it unto you. Faith is not straining to believe against evidence. It is the quiet confidence that there is no gap between the unseen and the seen. It is the restfulness of knowing that the invisible root is already bearing fruit, whether or not the eye has yet caught the first blossom. And here lies a mystery most never dare to face. The moment you accept your new identity, the world is compelled to rearrange itself, but it will often do so in ways that baffle logic. Some things will dissolve without warning, others will appear from directions you never considered. Old pathways will close, not as punishment, but as the gentle hand of Providence, steering you into alignment with what you have claimed. If you cling to the old map, you will feel lost. If you trust the new state, you will see every turn as perfect. So I began to bless the changes without questioning them, to give thanks for the unknown steps ahead, knowing they were the natural unfolding of what I had already received within. And as this trust deepened, another truth emerged.
as soft and inevitable as dawn. What you dare to be in the silence is the only seed you will ever plant, and the harvest, though certain, will come in a form beyond what the old self could imagine, which leaves one final trembling wonder. If all this can come from 7 quiet words, what transformation waits in the words I have not yet spoken? It is in the unspoken word that the deepest currents move. The words you have not yet uttered are not absent, they live quietly within you, as seeds suspended in the stillness, waiting for the warmth of recognition to bring them into form. Just as the 7 words that called forth the $1,000 were once unformed, so too there are countless other arrangements of thought and feeling that could summon realities beyond the reach of your present imagination. The mind often clings to the familiar harvest, mistaking it for the limit of the soil, but the inner ground does not weary, it does not run dry. Every state you could possibly inhabit exists already in the great field of being, and every word you could ever speak in faith is already echoing there, seeking the ear that will hear it, and the heart that will claim it. To live by the law is to become that ear and that heart, to lean into the silence until it yields its treasure. When you first begin, it may seem as though you are crafting the words, carefully selecting them as a poet might choose the most fragrant flowers for a garland. But in truth, the words are choosing you. They rise in your awareness, like a gentle tide, bringing with them the scent and shimmer of the state from which they come. And when you feel their reality before you speak them, you are already in possession of what they promise. It is here the practice deepens, for you begin to realize that it is not the number of words, nor their cleverness, but the living conviction that saturates them. One might speak 1,000 hollow phrases, and move nothing, while another may whisper a single sentence, and watch the world bend. The difference lies in whether the speaker has truly entered the state from which those words are born. In my own quiet meditations after that night, I found that other phrases began to press upon me, not about money this time, but about the nature of myself. Words like "I am already home," or "it is done" in me would arrive unbidden, accompanied by a warmth in my chest and a sense of space around me. I knew these were not idle thoughts but doorways. To speak them with feeling was to step across the threshold into a reality where they were simply true. The scriptures hint at this when they say, "The word is very near you, it is in your mouth and in your heart, so you may obey it." The mouth and the heart, the speaking and the believing, are never separate in the realm of spirit. One without the other is like a lamp without oil, but when both are full, the light shines and the shadows flee without resistance. This is why you must treat the words you choose as living companions. They are not mere tools, they are expressions of the eternal I am within you. To speak them is to let that I am take a specific shape in the world, and once you have given it form within, the outer must comply. So I began to ask, not in desperation, but in quiet curiosity, what shape will I allow my am to take next? And in that question, I could feel the stirrings of new creation, like the faint rustle of leaves before a wind you cannot yet see. It is here, in the hush that follows the asking, that you begin to see the circle close. Not a circle of limitation, but of completion, the return to where you began, only now with the understanding that you have never truly left. The $1,000, the 7 words, the quiet moment in which they were conceived, all of it was a mirror, showing you the face of the one who commands reality by the stillness of belief. You see now that it was never the urgency of need that brought it, nor the strength of effort, but the quiet consent to be the one who already has. This is the unspoken rhythm of creation, not reaching forward into what is not yet, but sinking inward into what already is. The outer world is a patient servant, waiting for the inner decree, and once given it hastens to obey, and in this recognition, a softer desire emerges, not for things, but for the continual remembrance of who you are. You wish to dwell in that space where there is no division between thought and manifestation, where the line between imagination and fact is dissolved. For in that space, you are no longer chasing evidence of your power, you are living as the embodiment of it. The words you spoke, so few, so simple, were not magic in themselves, yet they were the perfect garment for the state you wore in that moment. You could have chosen different words, and the result would have been the same, had the state been the same. This is the hidden key. The world does not answer your phrases, it answers your being. Speak from lack, and the words are empty. Speak from fullness, and they carry the weight of the unseen into the visible. Now you understand why Christ spoke as though the thing were already done. When you pray, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Not believe that you will receive, but that you have. Past tense in the language of the outer world, but eternal present in the realm of the inner. You are not working toward the blessing, you are speaking from it. That night taught me something that no book, no lecture, no testimony could have given. It taught me that the door to every possibility is unlocked, and the key has always been in my keeping. It taught me that I do not need to wrestle with the shadow, only to turn fully toward the light within. And it taught me that the smallest, most unassuming moment of faith can ripple outward until it touches the farthest shores of my life. And so I live now as one who carries a treasure that cannot be spent away. The $1,000 has long since moved on to its purpose, but the awareness remains, and it multiplies without effort. I no longer ask if I can have, or if it will come, or when it will appear. I rest in the knowing that all is already mine, awaiting only my recognition. When I close my eyes at night, I do not count the steps between myself and the thing desired. I feel the end is here, the state is natural, and I speak only from that place. Whether it is 7 words or none at all, the effect is the same. For the power is not in the length of the sentence, but in the life breathed into it by the one who speaks. And as I drift into sleep, I know that even now, the unseen is arranging itself in obedience to the image I hold. It may take the form of a deposit, a conversation, an unexpected encounter, or something my mind could never have devised, but it will come, as surely as the morning follows the night. And in that certainty, I have found the only wealth I will ever need.